The Saturday morning rush at Groundwork Coffee had hit its peak, the line snaking past the pastry case and nearly to the door, when the scream cut through everything. It wasn't a startled yelp or a frustrated groan. It was the kind of sound that made every single person in the shop stop what they were doing, mid-sip, mid-sentence, mid-transaction, and turn toward the source. Marcus Jackson had already moved before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. His daughter Ava, 7 years old and wearing her favorite sunflower dress, stood frozen next to the pickup counter, both hands clamped over her mouth. The woman attached to those shoes was in her early 50s, maybe, the kind of woman who didn't just wear expensive clothes but wore them like armor. She had one hand clamped around Ava's upper arm, her manicured fingernails digging in deep enough that Marcus could see the fabric of his daughter's sleeve bunching and twisting under the pressure. "Take your hand off my daughter." His voice didn't match his size. He was 6'3", broad-shouldered, built like someone who had spent years carrying weight that wasn't his own. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline pulled slightly when he spoke, a pale seam against dark skin. But his tone was calm. Quiet, even. The kind of quiet that made the barista behind the counter stop reaching for a towel and start reaching for her phone instead. The woman, Victoria Stanton, though Marcus didn't know her name yet, didn't let go. She turned her head toward him, and her expression shifted from rage to something colder. Assessment. Calculation. The look of someone who was used to being the most powerful person in any room she walked into and was now deciding how much of a problem this large black man with the scarred face was going to be. "Your daughter," she said, biting off each word, "just destroyed a pair of $1,200 shoes because apparently nobody ever taught her how to behave in public." Marcus reached down and gently pried Ava's arm free from Victoria's grip. His daughter immediately pressed herself against his leg, her face buried in his jeans, her shoulders shaking with the kind of silent sobs that broke something open in his chest every single time. He put one hand on the back of her head and kept his eyes on Victoria. "You're scaring her. I need you to back up and lower your voice." The shop had gone completely silent now. Someone near the window was holding up a phone, recording. Marcus could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, the particular tension that settled into a space when a black man was telling a white woman to step back, the unspoken calculation everyone was making about how this was going to go. Victoria laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a weapon. "You need me to do something? You need?" She was already pulling out her phone, her fingers moving fast across the screen. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. I'm calling my attorney, and then I'm calling Child Protective Services, because clearly this child is not being properly supervised, and you," she jabbed the phone toward him like it was a knife, "are going to find out exactly what happens when you try to intimidate the wrong person. Ma'am, I haven't raised my voice, I haven't touched you, and I haven't threatened you. I asked you to stop grabbing my child. That's not intimidation. That's parenting." A man in a dark suit pushed through the front door, his eyes scanning the room with professional speed. Bradley. Victoria's personal security, though Marcus didn't know that yet either. He was maybe 40, fit in a way that suggested former military, and he was moving toward Victoria with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled her emergencies before. "Mrs. Stanton, what's going?" He stopped. He stopped dead, 3 feet from Marcus, and his face did something complicated. The professional mask slipped. Something flickered underneath it. Recognition. Disbelief. And then, unmistakably, fear. Victoria didn't notice. She was too busy winding up for the next round. "Bradley, get this man out of my sight. And call the police. I want him arrested for assault." Bradley didn't move. Bradley. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it was aimed at Marcus, not at his employer. "Kandahar. 2009. The words landed in the silent coffee shop like stones dropped into still water. Marcus didn't react. His face didn't change. But something shifted behind his eyes, a door opening onto a hallway he had spent years trying to keep closed. He pulled Ava a little closer and said nothing. "You were there," Bradley said, and his voice was shaking now. "The convoy. The IED. You pulled me out of the Humvee. You carried me 400 meters under fire. I thought I dreamed that. I thought I made it up because of the morphine." Victoria's phone was still in her hand, but her arm had dropped to her side. She was looking between the two men like she'd walked into a conversation in a language she didn't speak. "Bradley, what are you talking about? Do your job." Bradley turned to her, and there was something new in his posture. Something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. He stood straighter. His jaw was set. "Mrs. Stanton, this man saved my life. He carried me out of an ambush when everyone else was dead or dying. I'm not putting my hands on him. I'm not calling the police on him. And if you want to know why I'm refusing, you can fire me for it." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changed things. Sergeant Doyle walked through the front door of Groundwork Coffee like he'd walked through 1,000 doors before, shoulders back, eyes moving, the kind of calm that came from 30 years of seeing people at their absolute worst and learning not to flinch. Victoria saw them before anyone else did. Her posture transformed instantly. The trembling victim who had been cornered by an aggressive stranger vanished, replaced by someone who knew exactly how to work a room. She smoothed her blouse, lifted her chin, and pointed one manicured finger at Marcus like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. "Officer, thank God. This man assaulted me. He threatened me in front of witnesses, he grabbed my arm, and I want him arrested immediately. My attorney is on the way. I have the firm on retainer, and I expect this to be handled with the seriousness it deserves." The words came out in a practiced rhythm, the cadence of someone who had spent her entire adult life believing that the system existed to protect people like her from people like Marcus. She didn't look at Doyle's face. She looked at his badge, his uniform, the authority she assumed would bend in her direction because it always had. Doyle didn't move toward Marcus. He didn't move toward Victoria either. He stood in the center of the coffee shop, his weight balanced evenly on both feet, and let his gaze travel across the scene, the overturned chocolate milk, the napkins scattered on the floor, Ava pressed against her father's leg with her face half hidden, Marcus standing still with his hands visible at his sides. The barista behind the counter had her phone out. 3 customers at corner tables were watching with the frozen attention of people who couldn't decide whether to intervene or record. Then Rachel stepped forward. She was maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and a Groundwork Coffee apron stained with espresso grounds. She'd been working the register when Victoria had started screaming, and she'd done something that most people don't do in these moments. She hadn't frozen. She hadn't looked away. She'd pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and hit record. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment, "I have video of the entire thing. From before the chocolate spilled until right now. 11 minutes. No cuts." Victoria's head snapped toward her. "That's inadmissible. You had no right to record me without consent. I'll have my attorney." "Ma'am," Doyle said, and his voice was quiet but it cut through hers like a knife through butter, "let the young lady show me the video." Rachel walked over to him, her phone held out with both hands like she was offering evidence in a courtroom. She'd already cued it to the beginning. Doyle took the phone, held it at an angle where he could see the screen clearly, and pressed play. The coffee shop went silent. On the screen, in the slightly shaky footage of someone filming on a phone they were trying to keep steady, the scene replayed itself. There was Ava, small and careful, carrying her hot chocolate with both hands. There was Victoria, barreling through the crowd without looking, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes fixed on something far away and more important than the people directly in front of her. The collision. The chocolate spilling across Victoria's blouse. Her scream, muffled slightly by the phone's microphone but still sharp enough to make Ramirez flinch. And then Victoria's hand, reaching down, grabbing Ava's arm hard enough that the little girl's shoulder twisted at an unnatural angle. Marcus's voice on the recording was low and controlled. "Ma'am, let go of my daughter." Victoria's response came through clear as glass. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what that blouse cost?" Doyle's face didn't change as he watched, but something behind his eyes went very still. He watched Victoria refuse to release Ava's arm. He watched Marcus step forward, not touching her, not raising his voice, using his body as a barrier between his daughter and a woman who had decided that a 7-year-old was an acceptable target for her rage. He watched Victoria pull out her phone and threaten to call CPS. He watched Bradley enter, watched the recognition cross the security guard's face, watched the moment when a man who had been paid to protect Victoria Stanton chose instead to stand beside the man who had once carried him out of a burning Humvee 400 meters from an IED blast in Kandahar. 11 minutes. Doyle watched all of it. When the video ended, he handed the phone back to Rachel without a word. Then he turned to Victoria, and his expression was no longer neutral. "Mrs. Stanton," he said, "I've been doing this job since before some of the people in this room were born. I've seen a lot of things. But I don't think I've ever seen a grown adult grab a 7-year-old child by the arm and then call the police on the father for asking her to stop." Victoria's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "I want my attorney. I'm not saying another word until my attorney is here." "That's your right," Doyle said. "But you're not the one filing a report here. You're the one being named in one." He nodded at Ramirez. "Cuff her. You can't be serious. Do you know who I am? I sit on the board of 3 charitable foundations. I have dinner with the mayor twice a year. I will have your badge for this, Sergeant, do you hear me? I will personally make sure that you spend the rest of your career directing traffic outside a Walmart parking lot." The morning of the civil hearing, Marcus woke up at 5:47 without an alarm, same as every morning since Ava was born. He stood in the kitchen of their 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, the one with the leaky faucet he kept meaning to fix and the window that looked out onto a parking lot where someone had abandoned a shopping cart 3 weeks ago, and he made himself a cup of coffee he didn't really want. He'd sent Ava to her grandmother's house the night before. His mother-in-law, Patricia, had picked her up at 6, and Ava had packed her backpack with the careful precision of a child who understood something serious was happening even if no one had explained it to her. She'd included 3 coloring books, her stuffed horse named Thunder, and a granola bar in case Grandma forgot snacks. Marcus had watched her zip the backpack, her small fingers working the zipper with the concentration of a surgeon, and he'd felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the hearing and everything to do with the fact that she was 7 years old and already learning to pack for uncertainty. His lawyer, a woman named Elaine Okonkwo who'd taken the case pro bono after seeing the video, sat beside him at the small wooden table. She'd told him the night before that Victoria Stanton's legal team had been making noise about a settlement, about making this all go away quietly, and Marcus had said no without hesitation. Not because he wanted revenge. Because he wanted his daughter to grow up in a world where people like Victoria Stanton had to say what they'd done out loud, in a room full of witnesses, with a court reporter typing every word into the permanent record. The room filled slowly. There were no cameras, no reporters. Elaine had made sure of that, filing a motion to keep the proceedings closed to the media. But there were people. Patricia, sitting in the back row with her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. Bradley, the security guard from Groundwork Coffee, still wearing his uniform even though his shift didn't start for another 4 hours. Rachel, who'd filmed the video, sitting with her phone face down on her knee as if to say she was done recording, done documenting, done being anything other than present. And in the front row, behind the table where Victoria's legal team would sit, a woman Marcus didn't recognize. She was older, maybe 70, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and a gray cardigan buttoned all the way to her throat. She sat alone, and she didn't look at anyone. Victoria Stanton walked in at 9:07, 7 minutes late, and the first thing Marcus noticed was that she wasn't wearing designer clothes. No silk blouse, no tailored blazer, no shoes that cost more than his monthly rent. She wore a gray sweater, simple and slightly worn at the elbows, and a pair of dark pants that could have come from anywhere. Her hair was pulled back, no elaborate styling, and her face was bare of the kind of makeup that made her look like she was attending a board meeting even when she was buying coffee. She looked smaller than Marcus remembered. Not diminished, exactly, but human in a way she hadn't been that Saturday morning, as if the past 6 weeks had stripped away the armor of wealth and power and left behind just a woman in a gray sweater who had done something terrible and was about to have to account for it. The judge was a man named Harold Chen, and he had the kind of face that gave nothing away. He read the charges in a flat voice that filled the small room like water filling a basin: assault in the 4th degree, filing a false police report, and a civil rights violation under the state's hate crime statute. Victoria's lawyer, a thin man with expensive glasses, tried to object to the hate crime designation, but Judge Chen overruled him without looking up from his papers. The video evidence has already been reviewed, he said, and this court finds sufficient grounds to proceed. The testimony took 2 hours. Elaine called Bradley first, and he described what he'd seen with the calm precision of a man who'd given reports in combat zones. He described Victoria's hand on Ava's arm, the way the little girl had tried to pull away, the way Marcus had positioned his body between his daughter and the threat without raising his voice or making any aggressive move. He described the moment he'd recognized Marcus, the scar on Marcus's forearm that Bradley had seen for the first time in the flickering light of a burning Humvee in Kandahar province 8 years ago, when Marcus had dragged him out of the driver's seat and carried him 400 meters to safety while Bradley bled from a wound in his thigh. "You knew Sergeant Johnson from your time in the military," Elaine said. "Yes, ma'am." "And based on your knowledge of his character and your observation of the incident, did you believe at any point that Mr. Johnson posed a threat to Mrs. Stanton?" Bradley looked at Victoria, then back at Elaine. "No, ma'am. I believed he was protecting his child. I believed if he'd wanted to hurt her, she wouldn't have been standing there to call the police." Rachel testified next, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly as she held the phone that contained the video. She described what she'd seen, what she'd heard, the moment she'd decided to start recording because something in Victoria's voice had made her afraid for the little girl with the hot chocolate. She said she was going to call CPS, Rachel said, and her voice cracked on the acronym.